back to Change Ed, #1 rated, world-renowned education podcast for educators, by educators. Together, we're changing the landscape of education one episode at a time. I am your host, Andrew Kuhn, education consultant from Montgomery County Intermediate Unit, and here with me,
Patrice Semachek, an educational consultant from Montgomery County Intermediate Unit as well.
Today, we are talking about the E, L, and S part of STEEL's environmental literacy and sustainability. And we have a very special guest, no stranger to Montgomery County itself and Montgomery County Intermediate Unit. We have with us Erin McCool. Welcome, Erin.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're super thrilled to have you. Erin, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit further to our audience and share a little bit about yourself and maybe even why you're the one that's on this podcast and talking to us about ELNS.
Sure. Thanks so much, Andrew and Patrice. It's great to be here. So my name is Erin McCool, and I've been working in environmental education and conservation education for my entire career, most of which has been in southeastern Pennsylvania. Currently, I have two roles. So I'm the founder of a company that is called Cool Heron, and our mission is really to support environmental education centers and schools in creating and implementing really cool learning experiences for students that promote environmental literacy, that are engaging and relevant for students. And then also, I am the director of engagement at Wissahickon Trails, which is a watershed-based organization that is dedicated to ensuring the land, water, and people in the Wissahickon watershed are healthy.
The first thing I heard is that you're a double threat. You're
double threat, yes.
And the second thing is a question, which was, could you tell us a little bit more about watershed? I heard you say the word watershed, but can you kind of give us like a 10,000 foot view of what that is?
Sure, absolutely. What I love about watersheds is, number one, we all live in a watershed. Even if you can't see a stream or a river or any body of water, you live in a watershed. And in Pennsylvania, and especially Montgomery County, we've got some really cool and interesting watersheds. Essentially, what this is all of the land area that drains into a particular river or water basin that goes ultimately into the river. So here in Montgomery County, all of the land where we live drains into the Delaware River, to the Schuylkill River, and ultimately into the Delaware estuary. So we're all connected by our rivers and streams. Even folks that live miles and miles away from you, you're connected through these waterways. What's also interesting about watersheds is they can be difficult to manage in terms of the health of a watershed because nature does not follow our boundaries that we set as people. Watersheds span across school districts, across municipalities, and states. So the watershed boundaries are often different than human-made boundaries.
So nature is still refusing to follow our laws and rules and
surprisingly, right? Yeah.
What's interesting about that is, right, so we work in Montgomery County, we work at the intermediate unit. There are watersheds that go into another county, right? They like border
Sure.
or they're part of a different county. And so I imagine that might have interesting impacts on a watershed as well, that this county has one certain restrictions, laws, or expectations for how to interact or things that you can or can't do that would impact the watershed, and another one might have different ones. Do you experience a lot of that in your work?
Yeah. It's a huge issue when we talk about environmental justice and managing the environment. I shouldn't say managing the environment, but taking care of the environment. Mm-hmm. Water always runs downstream, right? And so if I were to put a raindrop right here where I'm sitting right now, that water is ultimately going to impact people who are further downstream in the watershed who are miles away from me. So what often happens in, how this actualizes itself is you have industrial activities, pollution that is happening upstream in an area. And the folks that live there may not even notice that there's something wrong with their watershed because everything that's going into the water, stormwater in Pennsylvania is a big issue. So everything in these big storms that are happening is flowing into the waterways and clogging up our rivers and streams throughout the entire watershed. We see those impacts most at the bottom of those watersheds. And so there's an outsized issue where municipalities and people who are living at the downstream area are experiencing all of the pollution, flooding, sediment, all of the problems magnified because it's all traveled downstream. And then when we look at, okay, who's going to pay for all of this, right? Who's going to clean it up? As people, we often say, well, that's your backyard. That's what's happening where you are. Of course, you would be the ones who care the most about cleaning it up. But if we were to be really effective and equitable, it's really everyone in the watershed who's responsible, even if the impacts are not felt by your community.
I'm curious if this is an accurate representation of what you were sharing with kind of being at the bottom of the watershed.
Sure.
Back in 2005, when Hurricane Katrina came through and it hit the Gulf Coast, the company that I was working for at the time, we mobilized a group to go down and do work and help provide relief. And what was so fascinating was that there was a part of New Orleans that was hit worse. They were significantly impacted, and they were that lower part. And I'm wondering if that's that same kind of mindset, right? Like that's the lower part, all water runs down. So it kind of all ended up in this spot. There was nowhere else for it to go. And, ironically, that was also the lower socioeconomic area and region. So they really needed this support. They really needed the help to kind of get back on their feet.
Even more so, right? And you laid it out very well. And it's not that these folks that live at the bottom of the watershed are polluting more or are less careful or are less conscientious. It's that they're experiencing the brunt of the entire watershed. And so that's a really important thing to bring up. And we see that across our whole region as well. That same scenario plays out. And so what you're starting to see are these coalitions and consortiums where municipalities across the watershed are coming together to do this work together and to share the burden, right? It's the burden of the work and it's the financial burden to make sure it happens.
So you kind of are living in the best of both worlds right now, Erin, because you have a very solid understanding of the standards because
Sure.
The role that you have in multiple jobs and in previous jobs, and the fact that you are in these companies that are kind of like partners for education. So do you see in the movement to add either environmental literacy and sustainability standards to Pennsylvania's version of NGSS, do you see those standards helping in the education of people who are potentially living upstream to be able to say, my impact living upstream does have a role in what's happening in the lower areas? Do you see that being a benefit of the standards or something that's coming out in the way we're educating our students?
Sure, 100%. I think that the environmental literacy domain that we have embedded in these standards is much needed and will be a really effective tool for teachers and for schools to say, yeah, this is important. And this is really critical that we're engaging students in this work. And this sort of brings me back to the why. We live in a world that is experiencing really complex changes all around, right? The environment, there's all sorts of uncertainty that our students are experiencing. And complex environmental challenges are going to take a real grasp of STEM and the ability for students to be able to kind of see how different content areas work together. We often talk about this in the work world, and I know in schools as well. We teach in silos, we work in silos, and as humans, that's one of the hardest things for us to break down. But if we're going to solve really complex challenges like flooding and climate change and watershed issues, we're going to have to learn how to work in these complex systems. And so I sort of see that domain of those standards as really the relevancy of everything that we're teaching. So when we engage students in looking at the environmental issues that are in their own communities and in their schools, we're giving them opportunities to build their own environmental literacy. And so what I mean by that is we're not teaching students in southeastern Pennsylvania about problems that exist on the other side of the world. That's very important. But we're starting here in Pennsylvania and saying, how is your community impacted by things like climate change? Right. And so students are able to go out and observe, yeah, I see my creek and it's flooding every year. Let's look at why. Let's talk to our representative and see what policies are in place. Let's talk to business owners and see how they've been impacted. Let's talk to our neighbors. Many of our students here have experienced trauma from the flooding that's exist. We have schools that have been out of school because of flooding issues. We have students who have lost homes. This is a big issue. And so students are learning about this. They're learning about the science of this. Why does a river even flood? Why is the rain coming in greater amounts? Why are we seeing more flooding? But then what are the social issues? How does policy help with this? How do we work within our social safety nets to ensure that people can be successful and thrive in changing conditions? And ultimately, we want for all of our students, no matter what they do after they graduate from our schools, to be able to live in this world as an environmentally literate person. That when they go to run their business or when they buy a home or if they see something happening in their community, that they know what that means and that they know how to advocate for themselves and they know how to make good decisions.
Erin, I appreciate everything that you're saying and all this information that you have and that you're sharing with us. The one thing that I was thinking as you were talking is that I know from our conversations that obviously the environmental literacy and sustainability part of our steel standards is a really interesting combination really of the science and of tech and engineering, because we're looking at nature, but we're also bringing in human impact. How are we impacting? How do we solve these problems? Our mindset that we had at one point in time is no longer the mindset. So how do we correct what's been done? Right. That's where, even though the watersheds don't have our boundaries, we do have boundaries. So it's like, well, you're grandfathered in, right? And what was okay at one point in time isn't now, but you don't have to do anything about it. It all ties together. But I guess as I'm thinking that these ELNS standards, again, are beyond watershed, why do they matter? Like if you were to tell people, this is what I tell them about why this matters. Why is that? What is it that you share with people about why we should be doing this and not just focusing on the science, tech, and engineering? Why the ELNS part? Why does that matter?
I mean, the world is facing complex environmental challenges. The challenges that we're facing, like climate change, are overwhelming and they are going to impact every single one of our systems. And so it's critical that at this point in time that students understand what's happening with these complex environmental challenges and how we're going to, I don't want to say solve these issues because the world is always changing, right? And we're not going to reverse some of the things that have happened. So for example, in Southeastern Pennsylvania, we often say Southeastern Pennsylvania will never look like it looked 500 years ago. No matter what we do, we're not going to restore it to historical status. But how can we thrive in the world that we've created? And we often talk about being resilient to climate change. And I think that that's important. We need to be resilient to the changes that are coming. But I would really push us further when we're talking with students and thinking about how do we thrive in the face of these changes. There's a lot of exciting things that are happening in the world now where we are thinking differently about how we create energy. What do we do with our waste? How do we create systems that will allow us long-term to live on this earth and be successful and at the same time work well with the environment that is around us. And so I think that the students that are graduating now are going to be at the forefront of this. When you think about a student who is entering high school now, in 5 or 6 years is going to be in the workforce and is going to be faced with, what do I do when my entire company floods out? Maybe I don't have flood insurance. How do I deal with that? And the systems that maybe we would have worked through 50 years ago are very different than what they're going to be today.
I think it's important to say as well that we are educating our students so they can be empowered to be proactive about what's happening and not reactive, right? Without the knowledge, without knowing what's happening, we end up finding ourselves just reacting to whatever the law that's been made, maybe not knowing any better and saying, well, I have to do this, versus knowing the long-term impacts and how everything is connected and why it matters.
And to understand it a little bit better so they can make more informed decisions. Like I remember, again, everyone knows I grew up in Florida and according to Andrew, I wrestled gators every day, but we didn't talk about these things as much. One, because they were a little political back in the late 80s, early 90s when I was in school. But I think also like part of we've experienced a lot lately about misinformation being out there. And I think being able to lay the foundation early on with our kids about what's going on in terms of the environment and things things like that through these new standards is going to be really helpful to dispel any myths that could potentially be coming out through the media or through whatever else is going out there. So I think if we can continue, that's why I'm excited about the new standards for environmental literacy, is because we're getting them to a place where they can understand it a little bit better. And when you know better, you do better. So
right.
It's pretty exciting that we're taking that step.
It's interesting that you say that too, Patrice, because it reminds me of this thought I had the other day. And I do a lot of professional learning around three-dimensional learning. I work with teachers across the entire country. And how do we shift our teaching to be three-dimensional? The environment and nature it has endless opportunities for three-dimensional learning and for a conceptual understanding of the world. When you take kids out into a stream, you can stand there and you can see the stream. You can point to where you see human impacts, where you see natural systems and human systems. And it's very concrete. But also, I do science training across the country with teachers. Mm-hmm. And we often ask teachers in the beginning, why is it important for my students to learn science? What are my goals for students to learn science? By and large, I've never heard a teacher say, I really want them to learn about adaptations. Like, I think it's really important that my students know all of the trees in their backyard and their Latin names. That never comes up. Right. However, what does come up is I want my students to think critically. I want for them to be able to make arguments from evidence. I want them to be able to see things in the media and be able to discern what is real and what is not real. And we want them to be able to make good decisions. And I think the environmental literacy standards is where that magic happens in Pennsylvania. Is we've got these great science standards and technology standards, but a lot of what you see in the environmental literacy domain is, how does this impact me in Pennsylvania? How does this impact people in Pennsylvania? And so we put it in Steele's, but I think that really this is interdisciplinary and can touch really every content area. There's a lot of social studies and communications that goes into this work.
Erin, one of the things I wrote down, and you perfectly segued into it and talked about, so I just sharing it because the irony of it is that I wrote down that the environmental literacy and sustainability standards in Pennsylvania are uniquely positioned to integrate all aspects of the standards, right? So all learning can come together in this spot, like we were talking about before, with the human impact and the environment, and what does that look like long term? What does it look like short term? What can we do? So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all of this. This is a lot to unpack for our educators.
We should have her back on because there's way more that we're going to have to unpack.
Right. I would love to come back on. I could talk about this stuff all day.
Well, we only have 15-ish minutes.
I know.
It'll be small little chunks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, there's power in these small bits of information, right? How can we have this message and to share it out? So on behalf of the entire Change Ed team, we want to say thank you for coming. Thank you for tuning in and listening to us. This is a systems thinking issue. Our impact impacts others. And this is something that we learned from COVID, right? How do we impact other people? And for us to be mindful of what that looks like and to empower our students. So knowledge is power. We encourage all of you to find your path to the environmental literacy and sustainability standards.
And subscribe. Stop. I can be last once in a while.
Yes, you can.
Oh my God. Stop recording.
Okay, I stopped recording.
Stop!
Are we done?